everyone, Dr. Jason Old here, surfer, historian, world traveler, and your host of the Surfing Historian podcast. This season, we'll be diving deeper into the nuanced world of surfing and examining the historical, cultural, philosophical, and even scientific elements of the sport we're all stoked on. So let's paddle out together and ride through the world of academia. Joining me today from sunny Southern California to kick off season 2 of the Surfing Historian podcast is fellow surf studies scholar Dr. Aaron James. Aaron's a philosophy professor at the University of California in Irvine, and today we'll be talking about his book, Surfing with Sartre, an Aquatic Inquiry Into a Life of Meaning. This is a book on philosophy that grapples with surfers' know-how as it relates to questions about freedom, control, flow, happiness, being, transcendence, society, and the meaning of life more broadly. Simply put, Aaron argues that we should work less and go surfing instead. By the way, you can find this book at surfinghistorian.com. It's featured on our homepage. And while you're there, be sure to check out our killer merch, as well as all the surfing nonprofits you can get involved with. I'm super stoked to have you on to share this book with our listeners. This book was actually gifted to me by the chair of the philosophy department at the University of South Florida, where I got my PhD. So I'm excited to get a chance to pick your brain about this fascinating book. But before we get started, I want to personally thank you, Aaron, as well as our listeners, for being part of this episode of the Surfing Historian.
Hi, Jason. Thanks so much for having me on. You mentioned the book. I could just tell you a little bit about the book Surfing with Sartre. I could tell you a little about why I wrote it. I mean, the idea was that I'd spent my whole life as a dedicated world traveling surfer, and also spent my whole professional career in academia being a professional philosopher. But by the time I started writing the book, I didn't really know what the two had to do with each other. I mean, despite the fact that philosophers are thought as or surfers are thought as philosophical, but I couldn't tell you, even though I'm devote my whole life to both things. So I thought the book was a kind of a cool chance, a fun opportunity to go back and mine philosophical questions, sort of the big questions for the ages about freedom and flow and happiness, control, being, the nature of work. Just run the gamut, write a kind of book that you can't really write anymore, but focus it around surfing and what the surfer knows, and then sort of extract philosophical lessons and maybe codify something like a surfer ethos around a whole range of these big philosophical questions. So that was the project. And maybe I should mention also, in case you want to ask me about it, but one of the chapters is about my trips to Nias in Sumatra, which I've been doing for like a month at a time, or sometimes 2 months longer than 10 years, but over basically my 40s. And there's a bunch of stories about my relationship with a local guy there who I usually stay with. But we do charity projects in some of the villages behind Lagundri Bay. And I'm now writing a book of stories about our charity misadventures and stuff. So that could be interesting if you want to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely, I kind of want to get the full scope of how you're leveraging, this position as a surfer, as a professor, as a philosopher, and how that's, in a sense, taken you around the world. And, as we've been talking about, you and I before, this podcast at its heart is really an attempt to show the world that you can be both a surfer as well as a scholar or a researcher or an academic. And I think, your work, particularly Surfing with Sartre, and some of the things you're doing academically are really embody exactly what, not only this podcast is all about, but what, our emerging field essentially of critical surf studies is all about. And so you do say, just kind of getting into your book, it's, as you were, alluding to, it's, you literally have this in the book. This book is also my attempt at figuring out what my two lives, preoccupations, philosophy and surfing, might have to do with each other. And you go on to say that inquiry brought me to Jean-Paul Sartre, the mid 20th century philosopher and literary figure. Why Sartre? Like why he in particular? Because of course you have him in the title of the book. So why him in particular as far as philosophers go?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the book is set up as a kind of something like a conversation with Sartre. If I could sit down and talk with him and explain to him what the surfer knows, and just think of like things like, could I explain it? Now that's interesting, like in part because Sartre has views on a bunch of the related topics, but he also, in Being and Nothingness, has these long discussions of this long discussion of skiing as an exemplification of freedom. And then at one point he says, "Well, look, and even better than skiing is water skiing." And it has to do with because it leaves no trace behind. So he's working like a phenomenologist does. He's trying to like test his general ideas about freedom against his intuitions about particular cases, sort of what it's like the best description of it. And that is a good way of doing philosophy and the way that philosophers now generally work. But in his case, he's doing it with this activity that gets extremely close to surfing. And I don't know if he ever heard of surfing. I mean, I'm sure he heard loosely of surfing, but he didn't seem to have any experience of it. But then the idea is the main sort of pretext of the book is, oh, if he could have just like gone to Hossiger had existed as a surf destination by the time, like he clearly had been skiing in the Alps, like was drawing from his own experience of skiing. But if he just really thought through surfing as the ideal, he would regard it as the ideal limit of aquatic sports. That's his that's his phrase about water skiing, like um, on water. And so if you really get into the phenomenology of surfing, the idea is, well, you'll see why that Sartre's view about freedom is wrong, right? It's more like I discovered more like what his colleague, longtime French existentialist philosopher colleague Merleau-Ponty, who by the way has been revived in the theory of perception and connection with action in the body, and also has a view about freedom. I mean, the surfer view is much more like Merleau-Ponty's view, and this is all stuff I discovered just by engaging with Sartre's thought, because I'm not don't work anyway on sort of continental or French philosophy, existentialism, phenomenology as such. It's not my area of expertise. So, but working on thinking about what the lesson of surfing is, or the best way to understand its sort of philosophical significance, got me into this stuff and made me feel like really excited that I came to understand surfing better. And then there's philosophical questions I came to understand better by thinking through surfing.
Yeah, Aaron, awesome. Thanks for that. That makes a lot of sense. And so I guess the kind of two things. One, you've mentioned the word existentialism. And I just, for our listeners and others who aren't, philosophers or familiar with that word, if you wouldn't mind just kind of defining that loosely. And then the other thing, like you say, you kind of create this hypothetical conversation with Sartre. And I'm just curious that if we had him sitting with us or on this podcast, what would be some questions you would ask him related to this concept of freedom or life or meaning of life? And so, yeah, just kind of curious to know what those questions would have been.
Yeah, sure. I mean, in a slogan, I guess existentialist, or at least one sort of key existentialist idea is your existence precedes your essence, is the way they put it. So you're just thrown into the world. You don't have an essential nature that you could live by or be guided by as your sort of natural purpose or essential purpose or God-given purpose. That's, there's no essence that tells you, what you ought to do. What's right for you to do, what is it for you to be happy. You just exist. You just wake up in the morning each morning and you're self-conscious and you have to ask yourself, what should I do now? And Sartre's playing into like a background tradition that suggests that if there is no essence, if we don't have an essence, or there is, then life has no meaning as such, and there is no sort of right or wrong, absolutely right or wrong thing to do. There is no inherent meaning in life. Except for just what we arbitrarily choose, just as self-conscious creatures. And Sartre seems to own that point, really double downs on it. But then you might wonder, do you really believe that, Sartre? Do you really think that? I mean, look at all the ways that our activities and our projects and the things we do choose, when you get involved in them, like when you get involved in surfing or skiing or whatever, I mean, it's not like you think that the value that they have, like what's good about them and doing them for their own sake, it's not like you think they have value just because because you arbitrarily chose it. I mean, you chose it because it has a certain value. I mean, that doesn't mean you were born to be a surfer and surfing is your essential nature. But once you choose to be a surfer, being a surfer is and loving it and devoting your life around it is like appreciating it as valuable for its own sake. Valuable and then as I explained, it's a valuable as a kind of attunement to the natural world, to naturally changing phenomenon, waves, and skillful adaptation to it, embodied adaptive attunement, moment by moment. It's a kind of flow, not just a flow in the experiential sense of like something that happens in your head, but it's literally you're in a flow relationship, a dynamic, ongoing, bodily, adaptive relationship with a naturally changing phenomenon. And that the experience of that dynamic relationship is what gives you a sense of an awareness of like harmony with nature, a sense of stoke, and like isn't this all just beautiful and worth doing for its own sake? Isn't this important? Isn't this reason enough to live? So that doesn't require us having a sort of preset meaning to life or a sort of a script that's either God-given or given by natural essence. But isn't that enough for meaning in life? That's really the big question the book asks. And aren't surfers just onto it, onto really appreciating that? And then would you really reject that? And if you do reject that, then the meaning of life question isn't sort of the same question that Sartre posed. I mean, it's a kind of much easier question. I mean, there doesn't have to be a big cosmic story or a big cosmic purpose, or it doesn't have to be even a personal essence or something like that to make life meaningful. Life can just be, the meaning of life can be just like the value of all the things that we do for its own sake: surfing waves, being with others in the waves, enjoying the sublimity and natural beauty of nature, increasing your skill as a surfer, things, all these things that surfers that know and love. And then there's lots of other things you can do in life that are of that character, and that's plenty of meaning if the test is being alive, being glad you're alive rather than not, as opposed to like, I'm stuck here. Well, how do I make the best? Should I live or not? To be or not to be. Well, I'm here. I haven't committed suicide yet. Let's just see if I can make the best of it, find some pleasure or whatever. That like coping with existence vibe, which is more of the existentialist frame, isn't sort of inevitable because it's like, no, yeah, we're here. And like, look, life is awesome. There's a lot to live for. Yeah, I'm really glad I just happen to be here rather than not. Because there's a lot to live for today and tomorrow, depending on what the swell is like, and like given what the waves were like last week. And so surfers really have an attuned sense of the value of life, like in the present and the immediate sort of past and future, without it having to add up to anything big and cosmic. I have further ideas about that, about what makes for meaning, but that's the argument in the book.
Yeah, no, thanks for, elaborating on that. And as you're talking, I'm sitting here thinking, a couple of things. Like, one, just the concept of surfing, and as you go into detail about, you actually, I think it was chapter 1, you give like terminology on surfing and all of these different things. But just at its essence, it's this energy that's traveling through the world, or traveling across the planet, that arrives in this certain space that then a surfer catches and rides this sort of energy wave. That in and of itself is just a beautiful thing. And above and beyond that, as you mentioned, like being out there with friends and that community. And I think of in places, say Nicaragua, and I know you spend time, say, in Indonesia and elsewhere, even just sitting there while the sun is setting, there's just something beautiful about it. There's something, it really fills you. You feel I guess kind of where I'm going with that is you feel like you're living, as opposed to the other option you were talking a bit about, like surviving. Like, okay, I survived today. I didn't commit suicide. I made it. As opposed to this concept of actually living and being in the moment and harnessing a this sort of energy form that's almost feels like it just traveled across the planet to us. But you do mention another philosopher that I'd like to pick your brain about, Immanuel Kant. And you said surfers would have Immanuel Kant would have praised surfers, and then you go on to say, whereas Plato, maybe not so much. What do you mean by that?
Oh, there on Kant, I think I'm making a joke, a passing joke about Kant. I mean, I don't think of the book as generally like very Kantian. And in fact, and maybe it's not so much Plato either, but it's a lot of Aristotle insights, kind of basically about the exercise of skill and its connection with happiness and activity for its own sake. That's the main theme. I mean, I think the joke about Kant is that, I mean, he thinks that, well, one sort of maybe unfair reading of him is that you're more praiseworthy for doing your duty reluctantly than you are willingly, right? And then so I'm praising surfers who are willing to go to work despite really not wanting to. So they're more praiseworthy than the people who go to work, because they love it, like. So the surfer who would really rather be surfing but still shows up to a job. That's not a lazy guy. That's the morally praiseworthy guy. But so I don't know if that's really a fair reading of Kant and necessarily, but the bigger lesson is more like an Aristotelian one, is that the things that surfers know about the exercise of skill and that is a kind of virtuous activity in athletic engagement with the world, with the real world in this dynamic activity, and appreciating that for its own sake. That's much more like moral virtue, than someone who's just willfully doing their duty. Now you can read Kant as agreeing with versions of that, depending on when he's talking about virtue as opposed to right action. But I think the things the surfer knows, uh, like really are onto a lot of things that the ancients, especially Aristotle, were after in their virtue ethics. Um, so that part's similar, but that's still without the part that you don't get as clearly in even in the ancient stuff, is the connection with the world stuff that you were mentioning. So like a sense of attunement with larger things, a sense that you belong to the world, that you're part of it, that you're not just attuned to the waves in front of you, but to the ocean that's producing these waves, and your awareness of the way that the storms in a faraway ocean are generating the storms, and you have a sense of connection to the larger world. That's a lot like what Freud thought of as the origin of religion. When one place where he thinks of it as having a sense of that you belong to the world, and the world is you're in you belong in the sense that you can't just easily fall out of it. You have a sort of a place in it. That sense of belonging is supposed to be the origin of religion. And you might think of that as a sense of the sublime as well, an awareness of the sublimity of the world and also your place in it. And that's something that's very palpable to surfers just in sitting out in the waves anywhere in the world, which is this amazing thing. You might think that your home is like the place you grew up or the place you've sort of vested. But this beautiful thing about surfing is, which we're all familiar as surf travelers, is you can go a really, really long way in the world and everything's really foreign, but then you just paddle out and you're in good waves, and suddenly you're like, like I've traveled home, and then that's a really beautiful way that you can feel attuned to larger things. And it doesn't have to be a cosmic thing. It's not quite all the way to like a cosmic form of religion, because it doesn't mean that you're like thinking about the place of the earth relative to the sun or in the Andromeda galaxy, and like, or let alone the origins of the Big Bang and stuff like that. It's more like, but you are aware of like the superstorm that rotates around the bottom of the planet and pumps waves half the year up into the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and you're like aware of the storm patterns and activity, and that's affected both your travel schedule and wave forecasts and your what you're planning to do this week and stuff like that. So you are attuned to larger things, and that does have what's at least often thought of as a kind of spiritual awareness, and compared to just work and trying to get more money and please your boss and get ahead and survive the real estate market and not stuff like that, like which was like seen as sort of paradigmatically not being attuned to like spiritual larger things. But yeah.
Yeah, I like you said, like watching the swell and kind of, as surfers, we also, like you said, like that sense of, you could travel all the way over to Sumatra, or you could travel to somewhere in Peru or even Hawaii, which for us on the East Coast is pretty far actually. But you paddle out and you're like, okay, like the dust settles and you just feel you're at home, you know? And it's also that humble feeling, especially in a big swell where you're like, this my life could get taken from me pretty quickly if I make a wrong move, and get held under or whatever. So I do feel like being there out in the ocean does bring perspective as well. And so yeah, I've got a lot of questions about, your chapter on freedom and stuff, but as a historian, I really liked that you talked about the labor movements of the 20th century in your book as well, and how it essentially made surfing more feasible, and sort of how these labor movements and some of the technologies, and particularly in post World War II, surfing became more feasible. Would you like to go into a little bit more detail in as terms of specifically how these labor movements of the 20th century had an impact on surfing?
Yeah, I think this is sort of the more political philosophy, social political philosophy angle of the book, that sort of the back part of the book is about. And I mean, what it is sort of situating the post-war era. The post-war decades were sort of iconic for surfing in popular culture, but also for, it was the emergence of what we think of as now surfing as a leisure sport. But if you unpack what made that really possible, what was novel about that, I mean, there's a couple things. One, it was the World War II. The U.S. became this prosperous middle-class country. There's low inequality, very low poverty, and for the first time, people had money and free time. And why did they have free time? Well, because the 40-hour work week before World War II had been adopted, and for the first time in the history of, well, the world, but maybe capitalism, there was sort of a new bargain struck, such that workers, would get 8 hours. The idea of the bargain is, you get weekends off and work 8 hours, sleep 8 hours, and have 8 hours for everything else, and that would be 40 hours. That new bargain didn't get going until after World War II, because you had the war, and the war sort of took control of the economy, and a lot of people are off to World War II and stuff. But when you came back, there was this sort of, it's seen as the heyday of capitalism in some sense, or the success of American capitalism. But what was really the beginning of was leisure, new leisure kind of culture that had never existed in the history of the world, unless you're going way back before, like pre-industrial capitalism, where people didn't work as much when they're living sort of subsistence level, like maybe, and they get it's a fat year, they hunted and got something they can eat that will store, then they don't have to eat as much, they can relax. But for the first time, people could have a steady income, but then have a lot of free time and be devoted to surfing, have a lifestyle around the beach and have community, and then be dedicated to surfing as a sport, and use the war technologies to revolutionize, surfboard design and appropriate wetsuit stuff. A lot of that came from war technologies or engineers in Southern California area retooling design. So like to really be dedicated to the craft of it. And then so what you think of as capitalism is really marked by leisure as much as it is like increase in wealth. And then the idea is, looking forward, and part of the argument of the book is, for climate reasons, we should double down on that and reduce the work week even more, sort of developing on the big innovation of the 40-hour work week, and then use the efficiency of capitalism for us to have a good standard of living, an inclusive and equitable one, but I'll have all of us steadily work less and less and spend less of our time just making money and doing things that are sort of intrinsically important to us in the way surfing is, and also ecologically friendly in the way surfing is, at least the act of surfing itself, not the driving or the flying or whatever. That's, you've got to do other things which require a lot of work to make that stuff green. But the part I really loved about making this argument and working on this in the book was getting into some of the deeper history and the way that surfing interacted with political culture, going pretty far back. I mean, so it's I just mentioned the way that surfing became iconic and an embodiment of prosperity and freedom. But going farther back, like Captain Cook's vessel, on one of his trips around landing at Tahiti, he and his crew discover Tahitian surfing, and some of them even try it, like on a canoe or whatever, and they describe it. they describe it, and then these stories were circulating back, because at the time Europe was really fascinated by all the age of exploration and piracy and stuff like that. Piracy, which has big connections to Nicaragua, as you know. I've been super into pirates and history of piracy lately, right? So hearing stories about Nicaragua, but um, but then, I mean, Captain Cook wasn't a pirate; he was just an explorer. But then these stories got back to Europe and were part of what inspired the age of the revolutionary age. You know, the French Revolution and the American Revolution. And that was because for the first time they thought about life as just sort of, well, it revived the ancient idea that life's just to be lived for its own sake, that happiness is important, that it's possible. I mean, the idea wasn't just like happiness is a vague thing that could be theoretically possible. I mean, it's happening. It's happening down in Tahiti. Look at these abundant places, beautiful surroundings, lots of fruit. You know, like there's stories about the women and a lot of stuff. You know, but then there's surfing. You know, too. Like, so the stories about that were circulating back, along with stories of pirates and South Seas adventures and circumnavigation and the Spice Islands and stuff like that, which includes Sumatra, by the way. I have these new stories. Like, so all that was really percolating within Europe and did influence philosophers like Rousseau, Kant, Locke, who then, you know, theorized about the possibility of a new social contract, throwing out the aristocracy and the monarchies and stuff like that. And then that prompted revolutionary fervor at you know, later in the 1700s. So I mean, that surfing was of a piece with those cultural political developments in a really important way, even back then. And then sort of later, you know, and then it sort of really happened again in a big way with the post-war era in the United States. And the idea is to, like, once you think about those historical currents, you can think about the larger history of capitalist political economy, or the balance between market and state, and sort of how it should go, like, sort of, so we can have a more attuned form of an economy, a more attuned economic relations, you know, on a changing planet and stuff like that. So it's, instead of seeing like the surfers, these no good freeloaders, you know, hippies who are, you know, good for punching and, you know, who should really get a job, like, and contribute something to society. You think, no, like they're on the vanguard of economic adaptation and how to be happy without having a consumptive life, and they're on the vanguard of civic virtue. These aren't the freeloaders, right? And that they always have been, and they still are, and we should celebrate that. And it's not just surfers; all the other sort of forms of leisure and creative expression and lifestyle that have since been innovated. And the digital tools, by the way, really have reshaped work and workplace expectations a lot, because of the coronavirus pandemic and stuff like that. So, like, how do you make sense of that? Like, well, look, we have to adapt as surfers do, and, you know, continue to retool capitalism for changing circumstances, including the new climate change and other ecological problems and stuff like that. So, like, surfers sort of put them on the vanguard of world history, surfing and surfer, and having insightful lessons, you know, sort of as a sort of central in that way, and politically important in that way.
Yeah. So I guess, yeah, and I completely, you know, agree with what you're saying. And yeah, by the way, the whole piracy thing, it was Grenada in Nicaragua, which is the oldest colonial city in Central America, founded in 1524, I believe. Definitely was certainly had its fair share of, you know, piracy. I think it was Sir Francis Drake, but I don't want to get off topic with that. But yeah, it's certainly was you know, was susceptible to piracy, no doubt about it. I do want to bring us back to what, you know, talking about surfers and the sort of their ethos, if you will, being sort of on the forefront, or, you know, a vanguard, if you will. And I'm, you know, butchering kind of how you said it, but when you know, I know you talk about this book a lot, and, you know, probably present it and whatnot, but what are people, non-surfers, responses to that sort of claim about surfers? Because it really, I'm sort of maybe playing a bit of a devil's advocate, you know, as a surfer myself, but it seems like it's romanticizing surfers a little bit too much. Is that what, in other words, what kind of response do you get from non-surfers when you make these sort of bold claims about surfers?
Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing is people say, well, of course you would say that. You're a server. This is sort of self-flattery, or flattering your tribe or whatever. And that's partly true because in the sense that, there's things that are surfers are very well acquainted. There's lots of darker underbellies, not just criminal elements or but ways that the meaning of surfing gets distorted within surfing, or maybe competitive surfing distorts it, or, like to some degree. There's debates to have about that, right? Which are good debates to have, or sort of ideals about surfing that are hard to live up to for most surfers, stuff like that, and sort of nagging. Now that we're confronted with what we're missing out on social media every day, like every last swell and every best wave and all over the world, seeing that through our social media feeds every day. The FOMO is like harder than ever, like as a surfer. So the life of a surfer is like for loving waves is like, it's like harder in the social media age, and like than you might think of just, people blissfully out enjoying the waves. Anyway, so there's like the realistic sides of like that the depiction I gave doesn't sort of get at. And I get into that stuff in the book, but the through line is this more celebratory aspect. But in another sense, I'm not apologetic at all about this more celebratory thing, because I mean, look, speaking of pirates, they're interesting for the same kinds of reasons. I mean, like for similar reasons of their cultural political influence. I mean, pirates, hundreds of years before the rise of modern democracy, before Rousseau wrote about it, like in a probably high, like in a fit of inspiration, before he writes about it as just this dream, like pirates were doing it, like pirates, not even, or privateers who weren't necessarily like illegitimate or murderers or whatever, they're Democrats. They took a vote on everything. Like they all the spoils they would share equally. They did, like, you lose an arm or an eye, you'd get compensated for that. If it was your boat, you'd get extra. I mean, it was extremely both democratic and highly egalitarian. I mean, they were running little social contracts that which you were agreed to ahead of time for the boat, and enforced with often brutal sort of means and stuff like that. But still, from a sense of fairness and a sense of political morality, that's much closer to where world history went, right? I mean, it's expressly true. And some of the first even experiments in land-based democratic forms, like in the Bahamas, well, the first Caribbean experience, these are like pirate adjacent, like little experiments, or the Pirate Republic, like they really were like experimenting with these early on. So like, um, um, that's just something that's like really interesting political history, and those stories had a huge influence on political attitudes and revolutionary moments and stuff like that. So that kind of cultural history sort of from below is something that's just real, I think, is real history, and often neglected with the sort of some of the standard narratives, it was just wars and political leaders and stuff like that. So that's I'm not a professional historian, so there are people who are more capable than I of telling that, even the surfer version of that. But that's the kind of thing I'm trying to draw out in the book, and alluding to in my own ways, or just trying to give a nod to and give credit to writing about it. I think there's, by the way, a cool book I wish a historian would write about the surfing piracy privateer connection and its larger influence, because there's really age of exploration. There's lots of parallels between that and the surfer post-war era age of exploration. That's not always piracy. Sometimes it is just like legitimate exploration, but in some of the same regions. By the way, like Spice Islands, Sir Francis Drake, went all the way out there, but and then from the other side coming down the Malacca Strait, that's between Sumatra and what's now Malaysia and Singapore. But like disputes within that zone between the Dutch East Indies companies and the Portuguese privateers, like that led to like Grotius's treatise on the law of the sea that became important international law doctrine, and then it is the intellectual foundation for a lot of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and the social contract tradition, which then inspired the French and American revolutions. I mean, that stuff started because of these like So like there's lots of these really cool connections that have to do with the waves and ocean and seafaring voyages and surfers and at a later stage. And by the way, that same zone, Sumatra, is where a lot of the surfer age of exploration got going, as well. So there is there are real histories to tell about this that professional historians like I mean, so I'm just nodding to that kind of important work, I think, which is just really, really awesome.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt, and I think they're, as odd as it may seem, I think someone that is highly revered in the philosophy realm, Michel Foucault, someone like that is really, for all of us historians, he's actually pretty instrumental in something you mentioned. You mentioned cultural histories, like Foucault's approach to things, and without going into too much detail with Foucault, he helped usher in what we now call cultural history. And so what you're talking about, what you're kind of giving the nod to for historians, is largely feasible and conceivable because of some of the philosophers like Foucault and others that were initially not highly revered by historians. A lot of them would say, oh, he had no real methodology, blah, blah, blah. And then eventually helped to usher in what we call the cultural turn, which for historians like myself allows us to view, say, history through the lens of surfing. So maybe there's an aspiring historian listening to this episode and is like, man, Aaron's spot on. I want to compare surfing and piracy. Hopefully we've inspired someone to do that. But yeah, I want to bring you back to, like I said, something I think you titled chapter 2, freedom. And I just want to get more into that, and then leave a little space for you to really hear about your project in Sumatra as well, and how that's unfolding. Because I also think that our listeners would be pretty stoked on, what you have going on there. But when we talk about surfing as freedom, I know we've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but really when we talk about surfing as freedom, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, well, I guess it's using surfing as a way of unpacking what freedom means, in contrast with what Sartre thinks it means, and where he's picking up on a really sort of familiar philosophical image of it. I mean, his image of it is like there's the world, and then you as the free being are sort of sliding along independently of what the world or your history or is doing. So you're free and self-determining in the sense that's inconsistent with the world being a deterministic causal structure, right? So if you're free, the world can't be deterministic. These two things are not compatible. If the world's deterministic, we can't be free. And so he thinks the world has to be indeterministic, so that because we are free, we're radically free. So that image is sort of, as it were, stripped away from all the sort of circumstantial and material and embodied, as he would put it, encumbrances. Sort of freedom is escaping that stuff, right? And now I think that's really just wrong about what surfers think of as freedom. I mean, it is about escaping the encumbrances of the workplace and like the demands of a 40-hour work week and like and money making and like you know um, um, you know partnering and marriage where that's tied around real estate and all that business. Like it's get freedom from all that is what's partly what the surfing is about. But if you think, what is it that surfers are celebrating when you feel free on a wave? It's not that I'm somehow it's that I'm very deeply engaged and embedded in my circumstances in a deeply embodied way because I'm in tune through my habitual exercise of skill and my surfing practice. And it's not even that I'm start with think I'm choosing and determining this. It's not even that. I've sort of put myself in this mode, but then flow in the wave and is this dynamic attuned relationship. I'm often losing my sense of self, and I'm losing even specific intentions to do this or that. I'm like, things are just happening spontaneously, and what I marvel about, like after a great wave or after getting a good barrel or something, is not that I made all that happen, like that was me exercising control, being free. It's like, no, that because I could not have control, I could just be attuned and engaged and embedded in the naturally changing wave, and then this remarkable confluence of skill and circumstance happens, and that's totally like extraordinary. I mean, the Stoke is, I think, is an awareness of this remarkable confluence, fortunate confluence of skill and circumstance. That's what's totally joyous. That's why it's fun. Just after a good wave, you kick out on the inside. There's no one around. You just find yourself, hooting. Just it's not even for others. It's just this existential, celebration. Because wow, what a beautiful thing that, like, I'm alive for this rather than not. That history came together for this. The ocean served up just that with this wave on this day, and then I was just in the right position on the takeoff, and then I connected the sections just the right way. I pulled in the tubes right moment. I adjusted the right. Like all that happens without a lot of self-consciousness, without exerting a lot of control, just because like the history of your practice and your skill set, it all comes together is what we're celebrating, right? That's freedom. And that's a really different sort of much more embedded in circumstances, dynamic, attuned idea of what freedom is than what Sartre is talking about. And if that means, for example, that if you think, well, what's freedom in life generally, if that's the surfer conception of life, well, it's being deeply engaged in a conversation. It's being deeply engaged in a relationship, in love with somebody. It's like being deeply engaged in your society and its politics to improve it, or like to celebrate what's good. Really aware of what's valuable for its own sake, but deeply engaged in attune with others, like coordinating, cooperating. So a lot of things, that's freedom. It's not like it's not a lot of other things that get associated with freedom. It's not associated with power and things like that, right? So you can kind of correct. Surfing helps you correct certain images of freedom that are very familiar in philosophy and then do have a big influence in politics. So I think this, and that really is true, I think, to what surfers cherish about riding a wave, and what other people from a distance appreciate about it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I hate to use the old cliche adage, but, only a surfer knows the feeling. And of course, there's other sports and other things where we could apply that. But, there is some truth to that where, as you said, you could be out by yourself, catch this killer wave, and then you're just hooting all by yourself out into nothingness. And yeah, I know and I think really, again, I'm not a philosopher, but where I find sort of an overlap with what you're talking about is also, say, one of the practices of yoga, and that's kind of being in the present. And I feel like when you're surfing, you are in that present moment. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, being present does bring with it a sort of freedom. And so I don't know, I don't want to misinterpret what you're saying, but does that sort of fit with where you're going with your understanding of surfing and freedom?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think freedom can be a lot of different things, and I think thinking about surfing and what's valuable about it can help, like, bring out a lot of different aspects of it that certain philosophical images, like, don't really capture. So I guess the thing, but there's a conceit of the book, which is surfing is the greatest thing ever, and no one else understands, and everyone should. And that I can't really defend that. That's where everyone will be like, well, of course you do. And I don't believe that, but I do think there's distinctive value. The distinctive value in surfing, or distinctive way that it amounts to freedom. It is really distinctive, and and for that reason, it's really interesting and important, and it can help shed light on ways that other things are similar. So the freedom you mentioned, yoga, practice, like sort of there's a Buddhist ideal of self transcendence that you get through habitual practice and a loss of sense of self. But they go really far with it, right? In the sense that they think that, like, Gautama, the Buddha, maybe the only one who's achieved enlightenment. Maybe some others have, but that's a complete, like, realization that you have no self, that you're totally at one with the universe. That's a very dramatic and demanding, and to the point of asceticism in some Buddhist traditions. Like, that's a very demanding idea of freedom. Like, we're shackled with ideas of self, and freedom only comes with full enlightenment that maybe no one ever achieves. Like, different Buddhist traditions differ about that, but now what the surfer says about this, well, look, no, freedom is like, there's similarities, but it comes more easily than that, because like, look, you can have complete self-transcendence, like on a wave or in a tube, like a complete loss of yourself, but that can be a very fluid kind of thing. I lose myself completely, but then I'm aware of my body position, my arm, and the way I twist a little bit. I twist a little bit and correct, and then I'm back completely absorbed. So, like, absorption and can come in degrees, and self-transcendence can come in degrees, and it can come with skillful activity. So it's more available, as it were. Freedom is more available than you might think if you're operating with a Buddhist idea of freedom and self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is more available, and it's sort of less demanding, because there's a thing that's a doable thing, which is you just surf a lot and you go surf, you go out and practice. You don't have to like give up sex and like some Buddhist demands, or like become very rigoristic about your practice. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's for people who like that, but you don't have to have an aesthetic or even very highly disciplined lifestyle to have a freedom that is valuable in a lot of the same ways that, say, Buddhists aspire to. So I don't know. So like I think surfing in the distinctive way that it's good and beautiful helps sort of maybe correct or rebalance certain other ideas of freedom, and in that way. I'm happy letting it be its own thing in that way. Revealing in its own way.
Yeah, and I'm certainly not trying to pigeonhole us as surfers, nor as individuals seeking, as to use the word from the book, freedom. But I do really like. I think it was the description of the book. Um, what a surfer knows, and knowing how to ride a wave bears on questions for the ages. You really do take surfing and um, deconstruct or analyze a lot of these questions that philosophers have been grappling with for ages. I'm just kind of reading, essentially the description, but freedom, control, happiness, society, our relation to nature, the value of work, and the very meaning of life. And so I do think you've done an incredible work on this, sort of grappling with and picking apart and analyzing this concept of freedom in surfing, and applying it to a philosophical frame, if that makes sense. And so, segueing a bit away from the book, I would like to hear a bit more about this project you have going on in Sumatra, and how it actually, it doesn't have to, but if it does, and how does it apply to your overall lifestyle of philosophy and surfing? Like, what compelled you to do this new project?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's a little bit of a segue from the book, because I think that I don't think anything I said in the book was wrong, but I think there's something I didn't emphasize that I now believe about meaning in life, about the concept of meaning, which is, I think it's this narrative or story based idea, and that doesn't come out in the book so much. But that is something that I'm now trying to do in this more recent book project. I'm trying to develop a story based conception of meaning by telling stories about my charity misadventures in Sumatra over my 40s. It's more than 10 years, but so like I've gone to Sumatra just surfer chasing waves, like, but it happened that the Losman, the guest house I would stay every time there at Lagundri Bay, is the same guy named Damien. He goes by Damien, but his birth name is Democracy. Wow, actually, and he goes by Damo. So the relationship I developed with him, I like became close to them and trust him, and he's very public spirited. And then sort of realized at one point that he had really great connections with the villages behind, and that he'd done some post tsunami, after the big tsunami that hit there, he'd done some charity, sort of built a school and stuff like that, like in those around back there. And so I thought, and I'd also, because I do work in political philosophy and wrote a book about, I was at the time working on a book about fairness in the global economy. I thought and I was really interested in development economics and some of the new trends in sort of social science of development economics. I thought, I want to try my hand at some of the stuff like on the ground, kind of put this into practice. And then here I have this relationship with this local, and he can facilitate the whole thing. So we can basically be like a two-person, no overhead, two-person charity projects. And I'll just use my own money for starters, and maybe we can raise money later and stuff like that. So I got going on this project in this way. And then Well, I have lots of crazy stories. I mean, look, we had lots of really good successes, like building water tanks and public toilets, and distributing rehydration packs to prevent diarrhea and stuff in the villages, and lots of successes over the years. The biggest one was that the local government, as a result of Damo's prompting, put in electricity for 5,000 people, like a whole bunch of villages, which really helps. But for the most part, the story is one of sort of, well, not being a complete success, not relative to what I had like really was hoped for, was aspiring to then. And so there's lots of setbacks and tragedies that happen, and a lot of gnarly surfers are into the gnarly. So I'm like lots of gnarly stories. So lots of good things, lots of gnarly stories, and it's all mixed. And how do you make sense of it? Well, I'm framing that around as a story around my sort of midlife, as a story of my 40s, and how I'm trying to make sense of the meaning of my 40s. And I'm interweaving it with stories about my love life. So so it's misadventure and serendipity, and not just charity, but also my love life. Like, and so interweaving these two things, and then through like particular stories, but then they kind of weave all together. They coalesce in a kind of serendipitous way and add up to a story of not being a complete success, which is like, and then so the fun part of the book is that I tell the story. It's about all about me and about Damo, but I'm likening myself along the way to Don Quixote. So it's a kind of a riff on Don Quixote, and then where Damo is my like Sancho Panza, and sort of the evolution of our relationship is like the Quixote Panza relationship evolving. And then there's lots of deep philosophical themes in Don Quixote. I mean, Cervantes' book is a work of genius, and it was, and so I'm using some of those themes, like weaving those through my own stories, and so I'm retelling my own story as like a Quixotean misadventure. Uh, and then I'm also using that. By the way, this is another philosophical connection, but there's a sort of the effective altruist movement had got going around over the same years that I started doing this. Although I've never been connected to effective altruism, but it has philosophical roots that are connected. Because I mean, for example, like Derek Parfit, who's one of my professors, is a big influence on effective altruism. And then I grew up now as an academic working with Scanlon and Korsgaard, and our sort of Harvard-style rationalism as a grad student at Harvard was reacting oftentimes to Peter Singer's utilitarianism, and the effective altruists, they follow Peter Singer and like Derek Parfit. And so there's these different philosophical currents that played out into the charity context and aid context in really different ways. And then I'm using my own stories as a critique of the effective altruists. I'm saying like I'm like Don Quixote, and I'm Quixotean in various ways, but those guys are the really super quixotic, like super, for all like in the pejorative sense. So like I'm making myself look bad and making them look even worse. This is the strategy. But anyway, so that's the book.
No, that's amazing, and I appreciate you sharing about your nonprofit efforts and the project you have over there. And I myself had a nonprofit in the Caribbean of Honduras, so I'm very well aware of the challenges. It gets romanticized a lot, like, oh, you're doing this project there and how awesome. And it's like there's some gnarly things that take place when you get involved in that way. And yeah, and so I'm also very familiar with Don Quixote, and yeah, what a classic, and what a fun analogy or comparison. But yeah, again, Aaron, I'm super grateful that you've taken the time to come on to the podcast, and I'm gonna have to give you the last word, even though we could go on and on about the concept of altruism, but instead of going too deep into that, I'm going to go ahead and give you the last word to bring this podcast to a close.
Well, how about the last word? Let me just very briefly give you the meaning of life, or what it is for life to have meaning. So here it is. Here it is, very simply. The meaning of a life or a stage of life, like your midlife, your 40s, or of all of human life, all of civilization, however we want to describe it, is just the best fitting, true story that you can tell about the events that occurred in that life. And it could be with like literary metaphors, serendipity, comeuppance, poetic justice, could be fortune, could be success, setback. The best version of the story that you can tell, that's the meaning. And then if you love the story, even if it's a story of not being a complete success, for example, then you can sort of embrace it as meaningful and celebrate it as sort of this as meaning, as genuine meaning, as the meaning of your life. That's it.
If you found my conversation with Dr. Aaron James enlightening, be sure to check out the next episode where I'm joined by fellow surfing historian Dr. Steve Estes to discuss his book, Surfing the South, The Search for Waves and the People Who Ride Them. During this episode, Steve and I will chat about the varying ways that surfing intersects with business, music, race, gender, environmentalism, and politics in the American South. You most certainly won't want to miss this intriguing episode. Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Surfing Historian. If you're stoked on these conversations, be sure to share, like, and subscribe to never miss an episode. And don't forget to check out our killer merch at surfinghistorian.com. Proceeds go to help keep this amazing podcast going strong. Until next time, stay stoked.